The whole history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies of what would become the United States. Let's remember, during the colonial period, mid-1600s, there was no such thing as white people. I know some people who are now called white find that shocking, right? Because they think whiteness is real, right? But whiteness was created. Europeans didn't call themselves white. We didn't call ourselves white. We weren't all members of one big happy family. Are you kidding? Have you studied the history of Europe? The history of Europe was about killing each other. That's what we did in Europe. We just killed each other before we figured out there were other people to kill. We just killed each other, right? I mean, that was the history of Europe. The English hated the Irish, right? Northern Italians didn't even think that Southern Italians were Italians. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back, right? There was no team called white, no race called white, but all of a sudden, in the middle of the 1600s, there was. Why? Why was it suddenly necessary to create this thing called the white race? Well, because rich people can count, that's why. And so rich folks looked around, the ones that owned all the land, you know, in the colonies, the colonial elite looked around and they realized something, that they were heavily outnumbered by African enslaved folks, by European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave, or other Europeans who weren't technically indentured servants, but they were still peasants, didn't have any money, didn't have any land.
How did white people become white people? I'm so glad you asked. I find that most white people have no idea how they came to identify as white. And because they don't know that history, they often fundamentally misunderstand the legitimate critiques of white identity politics. White people didn't exist before the middle of the 17th century, as in the middle of the 1600s. And if that rings a bell, it should. More on that later. This isn't to say that lighter-skinned people didn't exist. Of course they did. Europe is a real place with real people who have been there for a very long time. They just didn't identify as white people. They were Englishmen, Dutch, Greek, Gaul, Scythian. Princeton history professor Dr. Nell Irvin Painter chronicles the invention of this diasporic pan-European white identity in her book, The History of White People. She demonstrates how white identity was constructed primarily as a differentiation from black identity, an identity that colonizers and human traffickers made synonymous with enslavement and inferiority. And so the myth of whiteness, moral purity, superiority, and ruling destiny was born, which is kind of ironic since the origins of the term slave referred to Slavic folks, white people. Whiteness is and always has been a political identity, a fraternal order, a loyalty rewards program that depends entirely on all of its members agreeing to maintain the myth. And let me tell you, some folks are working very hard to maintain it.